Now here's the stupidest statement you'll hear all day, hopefully. Here it is. The world has changed a lot in the last 200 years. You're like, thank you very much. It was a free lunch. I guess it was worth it. But all right, so here we go. Let me rewind 200 years and just make that case. It used to be that the family was a hermetically sealed unit. That, in other words, everything you would need to survive, for the most part, happened within the family. Now, we shouldn't be too nostalgic about this. This could be really harsh. Maybe you hated your family, or your family was suffering certain oppression and things like that. It could be very difficult. But for the most part, everything you needed happened within your family. Your basic needs were met within your family. Your relatives were very close by. Your religious education would first and foremost happen at home. I mean, the early Protestant Reformation, in Luther's Small Catechism, we often forget this, but this was originally written not for the village pastor, only secondarily for the village pastor. It was first and foremost written for father and mother to take child on knee and to catechize them at home. So you would learn your basic religious education at home. We are, especially in the youth ministry world, we are worlds away from that. Most parents in our congregation feel like, I don't know what I would say to my kid. We're paying you. I mean, we're putting money in the offering plate for you to do that. And we're kind of at the first time in the history of the church where we have a congregation and families inside a congregation who feel like it's not their responsibility to pass on faith to their children. It's your responsibility as a specialist. And what they say is, oh my gosh, well, you went to this thing at Yale Divinity School. What would I do? You know what to do. You're the specialist and do this. But this is a really new historical phenomenon. Education would happen inside the home. Some of us were actually raised on the historical documentary Little House on the Prairie. Remember Little House on the Prairie? I'm still freaked out about the Halloween episode. When I saw it when I was 8, it still freaks me out. But remember Little House on the Prairie, when I was watching it growing up, I was always shocked because I was a kid going to a high school of 2,000 students. I was always blown away by the one-room schoolhouse. And the most fascinating thing was that you would have an 8-year-old and then like a 15-year-old that were taking classes together. And then usually the 8-year-old could read at a level that the 15-year-old couldn't. And there are some legitimate historical reasons for that. One, the 15-year-old was probably needed at home to work the farm or to do a harvest, and the 8-year-old was free to go to school because, after all, human muscle was needed more than a human brain at this time. But also, that 8-year-old probably learned to read and write, add and subtract at home, where the 15-year-old didn't have that. I mean, your basic building blocks for education happened at home. Your recreational life happened there, and then the family really was an economic unit. You couldn't wake up in the morning and think, I hate my family. Well, a lot of people woke up and said, I hate my family. But you couldn't say, I hate my family, I'm moving to LA and becoming an actor. No one could do that. I mean, you were dependent on these people to survive. Hate them or love them, you needed these people, and you were stuck with them. Now, fast forward through industrialization and into our own time, and all these circles have fallen apart. And they have become what the American sociologist Peter Berger calls the pluralization of life worlds. Now, what Berger means is that now each one of these worlds becomes a world unto itself, with its own practices, its own ideologies, and for our narrative here about relationships, its own intimate connections and relationships become significant in that. It becomes a world unto itself, Berger asserts. So to such an extent that you can imagine this, that everyone has breakfast together in the morning, and when they finish in this period, they all go off to do their own things. For instance, kids finish, they go off to a government institution to get educated. Dad particularly goes off to a corporation to go to work. And early on in this period, mom gets up and doesn't work the family's basic needs, but actually goes and buys them. And what happens is what's going on in these different worlds is not transferable to the others. In other words, parents have no idea what's going on in this government institution called school. And, kids have no idea what's going on with their parents at work. And it goes to such an extent that the way that dad treats his employees at work cannot be the same way he treats his children. So he can't come home from work and think, man, I would really like to upgrade to HBO. Some great new shows coming out. But I'm seeing we're paying Susie about $80 to $90 a month in allowance. Susie, come here. Susie, we've loved having you in this family. You have offered so much to us, but things just aren't really working out. We're going to have to let you go. I mean, Dad cannot treat his children the same way he treats his employees. That they're completely different logics. They're completely different ways of functioning. And so we become these people who have to bounce in and out of these worlds. So when I talk to youth workers, one of the things that they often complain about, if we were playing Family Feud and like top 3 things youth workers complain about, pretty close to the top is this statement. And I'm sure you people don't say it, but other people, other youth workers say it. They say, the problem with our kids is they act one way at church in another way at school. Has anyone ever said that or heard things said that way? You know, they act one way at church and another way at school. And we act as if that's an adolescent problem. Their parents do the exact same thing. They act one way at work, in another way at church, in another way at their recreational activity, and another way with their buddies they go to a bar with. I mean, this is what modernity does to us. It forces us to bounce in and out of these worlds. And you actually are more successful the more kind of different selves you can take on in these and mobilize these for yourself. So adolescence becomes this time of figuring out, when you're in particularly this education sphere or this friendship sphere, who you are and how to function in those. Now, it's no wonder then, in the context of youth ministry, that particularly after the 1950s into the 60s and 70s, we start to use this word relational ministry. Because you never talk about relational ministry in this world. It would be redundant. Why would you? You're given these relationships. You actually hate these people, but you're stuck with them in a relationship. This world now, you're an individual. And you bounce in and out of these worlds. And in each of those worlds, you have to figure out who's friend or foe, who's somebody to connected with, who's not. So a lot of your world becomes negotiating these relationships as you bounce in and out of these worlds. Now let me push this just a little bit further. Anthropologists seem to tell us that all cultures across time and space seem to have these 5 broad categories to them. Very broad. But there's something called family, something called society, something called government, something called economy, and something called religion. Now, they can be radically different across time and space, but there seems to be something like these broad categories. For instance, you can just think of ancient Hebrew family and Victorian English family, radically different conceptions of family, just polygamy, monogamy, I mean, radically different conceptions, but there's still this broad category called family. Now, if we were to imagine these like the continents in continental plates, the bigger they were, the more cultural esteem they had. If we were in the heyday, which I think was the wrong nostalgic assertion, but we kind of imagine, at least some of us in mainline denominations, imagine in the 1950s everything was okay. You know, if we could just kind of turn back the clock to the 1950s, everything was okay. Forget all the sexism and racism and all that stuff. But if people went to church, I mean, that was good, right? I mean, we kind of have this nostalgic illusion that everything was okay in the 1950s. But the truth be told, maybe, if you were to give these value, the bigger they were, the more cultural value they had, maybe in the middle of the 20th century they looked something like this. Family was huge. Religion was huge. The economy had its place, society had its place, and government had its place. But the two kind of driving cultural spheres were really family and religion. In this cultural context, you never had to convince a parent why they should send their kid to confirmation instead of to football practice on Wednesday night, or why they had to be at confirmation instead of piano lessons or tutoring. I mean, you're just going. This is the way it was going to be. We did this thing. These were kind of driving cultural realities. Now, if you fast forward to our time, I think these things have radically shifted. And they look something more like this now, if you can see that. That economy is huge, society is huge, the family has shrunk a great deal. Government, depending on your politics, has got a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, and religion has shrunk a great deal. It doesn't mean people are no longer religious, but it doesn't seem to organize their lives like maybe it once did. Now, if there's a second thing that youth workers always complain about, the first one is our kids act one way at church and another way at school. The second thing is something like this. Parents are the spawn of the devil. Have you ever said it? And usually what that all goes back to is this very fact. What they'll say to me is they'll say, my parents, my church, they just don't help me out. I mean, I'm working so hard, and they will send their kids to volleyball. They will send their kids to language camp. I get calls all the time that says, my daughter can't come to confirmation for 6 months because she just got the lead in the play. Why don't parents help us out? Why don't parents get us to church? Why don't parents see a value in church when they send them all these other things? And what I try to reframe for these youth workers, you people already know that, but what I try to reframe for these youth workers is that actually, I don't think they're the spawn of the devil. I think they choose to send their kids to piano. They choose to send their kids to SAT prep instead of church because, this is going to be shocking, because they love them. And what they've done is they tacitly, I mean, it's not necessarily cognitive, but in the back of their minds, they know this is the culture. And as hard as it is for us church people to come to grips with, and maybe we should really grieve this, learning a second language, knowing how to play a musical instrument, being on an AAU traveling basketball team holds way more cultural esteem than being confirmed or being a youth group member. It doesn't hold any cultural esteem. In this world, it maybe did more, so you didn't have to convince parents. But here, Well, why? Because if your kid can be on an AAU basketball team or your kid knows a second language, she can put that on her college transcript. And if she gets that, put that on her college transcript, she'll get into a good school. And if she gets into a good school, she'll have societal esteem. And she'll get a good education, and then she'll be able to go get a good job and compete in a very competitive economy. So I think they make these decisions because they actually love their kids. So Raleigh Martins is going to be here next, and Raleigh's a good friend of mine, and so I hope he may tell a story, he may not, but I'm going to steal this story from him. When you meet Raleigh, and you should come back to hear Raleigh, because Raleigh, this guy, he's almost 70, and he's so energetic, I can't keep up with him. But Raleigh is this kind of guy who loves to talk to anyone, so watch out if you're having lunch, because he will talk your ear off. But so when I get onto an airplane, I put every sign up that says, do not talk to me. I don't want to look at you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. Every nonverbal I can put up, I do that. Raleigh gets onto an airplane, it's like shaking people's hands. Hey, good to meet you. So he's sitting next to this businessman on an airplane, and of course Raleigh turns to him and says, so what do you do? And they're talking, blah, 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 blah. And Raleigh, of course, will talk to anyone about anything. So he says, so do you go to church? He's a theological educator, so he thinks this is a relevant question. You know? So the guy gives him this look, and he says, you know, it's funny. It's funny that you would ask me that question. He says, just last week we had a family meeting. And I have 3 kids, all ranging from, you know, high school down into junior high age. This is what this businessman is saying. And he says, we just realized we were way too busy. Like our family, we were just incredibly busy. So we decided that we were going to have a family meeting, and we put everything that we were doing, cheerleading, tutoring, everything we were doing, we put it on a whiteboard. And he said, we decided as a family we were cutting 40%, just cutting it out. So we went through this process, and he says, you know, the funny thing is, church got cut. We decided for this year we're just not going to church. Couldn't cut tutoring, couldn't cut violin, couldn't cut drama, but cut church. Well, I mean, what they're reading, you can just say, this guy's a bad guy. This guy's, you know, he's given up everything. Well, what he's read is this. And as hard as it is for us to face, this is more the cultural reality. Now, why this really matters for our narrative about relationships in youth ministry is because, again, when this is the operative cultural reality, guess what you get? When religion and family are the fundamental kind of driving cultural realities, you get relationship, whether you like it or you hate it. Actually, in the language of the early 20th century, late 19th century social theorist Ferdinand Tönnies, where he wrote this book, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, which just let that go over. I know when you say a German word after lunch, people get really tired. Anyhow, but what he basically said, the way this functions is this functions in a situation where you are actually asked to subordinate your own individual will to the good of the group. In this cultural context, it actually works the exact opposite. Economy and society only work if your individual pursuits are more important than everyone else. This is built on competition. This is built on you becoming the best. And just think about how that changes parenting style. Parents here, I don't care what you want to do. You're going to do this. This is what this family does. Here, as a parent, and I think of this with my children who are only 4 and 7, my job as a parent is help them to become an individuated person who is strong enough to grab their life for themselves. My job isn't to get them to assimilate to some kind of relational community. My job is to help them become individuals who are strong, who can be all they can be. And we'll talk about this a little bit with students this afternoon. But this changes because now where you would never talk about relational ministry here. Why would you? It'd be redundant. You're given relationships. There's really even no need for youth ministry in this kind of functional society. I mean, you are bound within this community. You know yourself within it. It's no wonder that youth ministry comes around for even this rhetoric of relational ministry really comes to the forefront when this culture starts to become mobilized. Because now you go into this big government institution called a high school, and who is your friend and who is your foe? Who do you date and who don't you? I mean, this was really set terms for good or for ill by your tradition, by your community. They told you who you would marry. They told you who your friend or who your foe is. Now, you're an individual. It's up to you to figure this out. So it's no wonder that youth workers, who I think had their ear to the ground, really recognized that kids were becoming obsessed with relationship because they were trying to negotiate it. Walking into a big government institution filled with other kids, they're trying to figure out who is my friend and who isn't. Who should I hang out with and who shouldn't I? Where do I belong and where don't I? And of course, adolescence or teenagehood just expands from something from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock. Now you can't get away from it. And so, especially with social networking sites, you're a teenager forever. I mean, you don't get a break from being a teenager. You're always a teenager. And you're negotiating where you belong. So it's no wonder that we start talking about the importance of relationships during this time.